In the winter of 1891, a fishing village on the Maine coast vanished from every map. 47 people lived in Kestrel Hollow that December. By February, not a single one remained. The supply boat that arrived in March found the village empty. Tables were set for dinner. Fires had burned down to cold ash in the hearths. Fishing nets hung drying on their racks. But every door facing the ocean stood wide open, and a trail of wet footprints led from each house down to the waterline, where they disappeared into the black Atlantic. The sea had come to collect what it was owed. Before we go any further, make sure you hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. Your support keeps this archive alive. My name is Edward Crane, and I am the only person alive who knows what happened to the village of Kestrel Hollow. I was there when the sea rose up and walked on two legs. I watched it take my neighbors one by one, and I know why it spared me. I am writing this account in the autumn of 1934, 43 years after the events I am about to describe, because the dreams have grown worse, and because the doctors say my heart will not last another winter. There are things that must be understood before I die. There are warnings that must be given. I arrived in Kestrel Hollow in October of 1891, 2 months before the drowning season began. I was 26 years old, a clerk from Boston with soft hands and no knowledge of the sea. My mother's uncle, a man named Silas Whitmore, whom I had never met, had died in September and left me his property on the Maine coast. The letter from the executor described a cottage, a fishing boat, and 17 acres of rocky shoreline. It said nothing about the village or its people. It said nothing about the debt that came with the land. The journey north took 3 days by rail and another full day by coach. The roads grew narrower as we traveled, the forests thicker, until the coach driver finally stopped at a crossroads and told me he went no further. He pointed down a muddy track that wound through dense pines toward the smell of salt water. He said Kestrel Hollow was 2 miles ahead. When I asked if he would wait for my return, he shook his head and said, "No man with sense stayed near that village after dark." I thought he was joking. He was not. I walked the track alone, with my trunk dragging behind me in the mud. The pines grew so thick that they blocked the afternoon sun, and the air between them hung cold and wet, with fog that never seemed to lift. I heard the ocean before I saw it, a constant low roar that seemed to come from every direction at once. Then the trees ended, and Kestrel Hollow spread out before me on a rocky slope that ran down to the water. The village was small, perhaps 30 buildings clustered around a natural harbor where the coastline curved inward to form a protected cove. The houses were old, built from gray weathered timber with steep roofs designed to shed heavy snow. Smoke rose from most of the chimneys, and I could see figures moving between the buildings. A long wooden pier extended into the harbor, and fishing boats bobbed at anchor in the calm water. It looked peaceful. It looked ordinary. I would learn very quickly how deceiving that appearance was. I found my uncle's cottage at the northern edge of the village, separated from the other houses by a stretch of empty land that no one seemed to use. The building was larger than I expected, 2 stories of solid timber with windows facing the sea. The door was unlocked, and inside I found furniture covered in dust cloths, a cold fireplace, and the lingering smell of pipe tobacco that must have belonged to my uncle. His belongings remained where he had left them. Shirts in the wardrobe, books on the shelves, a pipe on the mantel. It was as if he had simply walked out one day and never returned. That first evening, I walked to the village's only tavern, a low building near the pier called the Anchor's Rest. The interior was dark and close, filled with the smell of fish and tobacco smoke. A dozen men sat at rough tables, their faces weathered by salt and wind, their hands scarred from years of working nets and lines. They all looked up when I entered. They all stopped talking at the same moment. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was something else. It was the silence of people who had just recognized something they did not expect to see. The tavern keeper was a heavy man named Josiah Blackwood, with a thick gray beard and eyes that never seemed to blink. He poured me a drink without asking what I wanted and set it on the bar with a heavy thunk. He asked if I was the Whitmore nephew. I said I was. He nodded slowly and looked at the other men in the room. Some of them made gestures I did not recognize, touching their foreheads and then their chests in a quick pattern. Blackwood told me I was welcome in Kestrel Hollow, but he said the words in a strange way, as if they carried a meaning I was not supposed to understand. I asked about my uncle. I asked how he had died. Blackwood's face went still for a moment before he answered. He said Silas Whitmore had walked into the ocean one night in early September and had not come back. He said the body was never recovered. He said this was not unusual in Kestrel Hollow. Many people walked into the sea. Many of them did not return. He spoke as if this were simply a fact of life in the village, no more remarkable than the weather or the tides. I did not understand then. I would understand soon enough. I spent my first weeks in Kestrel Hollow trying to establish myself in the village. The people were polite, but distant. They answered my questions with short sentences and changed the subject when I pressed for details. They invited me to share meals but never spoke of their families or their histories. They watched me constantly with a careful attention that made me feel like a specimen under glass. I told myself they were simply wary of outsiders. I told myself their strangeness was the product of isolation. I was wrong on both counts. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came on my 12th night in the village. I woke after midnight to a sound I had never heard before. It was not quite singing and not quite speech. It rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost musical, but followed no rhythm I could identify. It came from the direction of the harbor, and it was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. I found myself standing at my window without remembering how I got there, staring out at the black water, desperate to hear more. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. In the silence that followed, I saw lights moving along the water line. Lanterns, perhaps a dozen of them, carried by figures walking slowly toward the pier. They moved in a single file line, with their heads bowed and their arms hanging loose at their sides. They walked with a strange, shuffling gait that did not look entirely voluntary. When they reached the end of the pier, they stopped and stood facing the ocean. They remained there for nearly an hour while I watched from my window. Then they turned and walked back to the village, and the lights disappeared one by one into the houses along the shore. The next morning, I asked Blackwood about the lights on the pier. His face went pale, and he asked me what else I had seen. I told him about the sound, the singing that was not singing. He set down the glass he was polishing and stared at me for a long moment. Then he told me that some things in Kestrel Hollow were not for outsiders to know. He told me that my uncle had learned this lesson too late. He told me that if I was wise, I would sell the property and leave before the drowning season began. When I asked what the drowning season was, he turned away and refused to answer. I should have listened. I should have taken his warning and fled that village while I still had the chance. But I was young and stubborn and convinced that the people of Kestrel Hollow were simply superstitious fishermen frightened by old stories. I decided to stay and learn the truth for myself. I began asking questions of anyone who would speak to me. Most refused. A few offered fragments of information that only deepened my confusion, but one person, a young woman named Clara Marsh, finally told me what I needed to know. Clara was the daughter of one of the village's older fishermen, a quiet girl of perhaps 20, with dark hair and eyes the color of sea glass. She found me one evening, sitting on the rocks near my uncle's cottage, watching the waves break against the shore. She sat beside me without invitation and asked if I truly wanted to know about Kestrel Hollow. I said I did. She nodded slowly and looked out at the darkening water. Then she began to speak. She told me that Kestrel Hollow had existed for more than 200 years. Founded by a group of English settlers who came seeking a place far from the laws and eyes of civilization. The land was poor and the winters were brutal, but the waters around the village teemed with fish. The settlers thrived for a single generation. Then the fish disappeared. The nets came up empty year after year, while the people slowly starved. Children died. Elders died. The village began to fail. In desperation, the surviving settlers made a bargain. Clara did not know who first spoke to the things in the water or how communication was established. She only knew that an agreement was reached. The sea would provide. The fish would return. The village would prosper. In exchange, the people of Kestrel Hollow would give back to the sea what the sea demanded. At first, it was only offerings. Fish returned to the water. Portions of each catch thrown back. Blood spilled on the waves during certain phases of the moon. But over time, the demands changed. The sea wanted more. The sea wanted lives. Clara told me that every generation, when the drowning season came, the sea would call certain people to walk into the water. Those who were called could not resist. Those who were called did not return. The village accepted this as the price of their prosperity. They accepted it because the alternative was starvation and death for everyone. They accepted it because after 200 years, they no longer remembered any other way to live. I asked Clara when the drowning season began. She looked at me with those strange sea-colored eyes and said it always began on the winter solstice. She said the singing would grow louder as the days shortened. She said those who were chosen would feel the call growing stronger until they could no longer resist. She said my uncle had been called last year. She said he had walked into the waves on the first night of winter and never emerged. I asked her how the sea chose its victims. She shook her head and said no one knew. The call came to old and young, men and women, lifelong residents and newcomers alike. There was no pattern anyone could discern, but she looked at me strangely as she said this, and I thought I saw something like pity in her expression. I did not understand why, until much later. November passed in a cold gray blur. The days grew shorter and the fog grew thicker, rolling in from the sea each morning and lingering until well after noon. The villagers became more withdrawn as the weeks progressed. They spoke less. They smiled less. They spent more time staring at the water with blank expressions that made my skin crawl. The singing from the harbor came more frequently now, sometimes 2 or 3 nights in a row, and each time it sounded closer than before. I began to notice changes in myself as well. I found it difficult to sleep through the night. I woke at odd hours with an overwhelming urge to walk to the water's edge. I caught myself standing at my window for long stretches without remembering how I got there, staring at the black harbor while the strange not singing echoed in my skull. The pull grew stronger every day. It felt like a hook embedded in my chest, tugging me toward the sea with a pressure that never fully released. 2 weeks before the winter solstice, I saw the thing in the harbor for the first time. It was late afternoon, the sky already darkening toward evening, and I was walking along the pier when something broke the surface perhaps 50 yards offshore. At first, I thought it was a whale or a large fish. Then it rose higher and I saw that it had shoulders, it had arms, it had a shape that was almost human, but stretched and distorted in ways that made my mind recoil. It was massive, at least 12 feet tall from what I could see above the waterline, with skin that looked gray and slick like the belly of a dead fish. Its head was too large and too round, with no features I could identify from that distance. It simply rose from the water, faced the village for a long moment, and then sank back beneath the waves without a ripple. I ran to the tavern and burst through the door, desperate to tell someone what I had seen. The men inside looked up at me with weary expressions. Blackwood asked if I had seen something in the harbor. I nodded, unable to find words. He poured me a drink and told me to sit down. He told me that everyone in Kestrel Hollow had seen them at one time or another. He told me they rose more frequently as the drowning season approached. He told me they were watching, counting, deciding who would be called. I asked him what they were. He shrugged his heavy shoulders and said no one knew. They had been in the waters around Kestrel Hollow for as long as anyone could remember. They were ancient. They were patient. They honored the bargain the village had made, providing fish and calm waters and protection from the worst storms. In return, they took what was owed. Blackwood said that some people called them gods, some called them demons. Most simply called them the Deep Ones, a name that had been passed down through generations without explanation or elaboration. I asked if there was any way to break the bargain. Blackwood laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. He said others had tried. He said a minister had come to the village in 1834 and attempted to perform an exorcism on the harbor. The Deep Ones had risen that same night and taken him, along with 7 other people who had helped him. He said a group of fishermen had tried to block the harbor entrance with sunken boats in 1867, hoping to trap the creatures inside. The Deep Ones had simply swum around the barrier, and the next drowning season had claimed twice as many lives as usual. The bargain could not be broken. The debt could not be refused. The only choice was to pay or to die. That night, the singing was louder than ever. It filled my cottage with a sound that was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it made no difference. The sound was not coming from outside. It was coming from inside my own head, echoing through my skull with a resonance that made my teeth ache. I felt the pull in my chest grow stronger, felt my legs twitch with the urge to walk to the water. I bit my tongue until I tasted blood and forced myself to stay in my chair. By morning, I was exhausted and trembling, but I had not left the cottage. I told myself I had won. I told myself I could resist the call. I was wrong. The winter solstice arrived on a night of freezing fog and absolute stillness. The sea lay flat and motionless, like a sheet of black glass stretching to the horizon. No wind stirred the bare trees. No birds called from the rocks. The village was silent except for the distant creak of boats at anchor and the soft lap of water against the pier. It was the kind of silence that felt like a held breath, the kind that comes just before something terrible happens. I had barricaded myself in my cottage that evening. I nailed boards across the door and pushed furniture against the windows. I told myself I would not walk to the water. I told myself I would not answer the call. But even as I worked, I could feel it growing stronger. The hook in my chest had become a fist, squeezing and pulling, with a force that made me gasp. My hands shook so badly that I could barely hold the hammer. My vision blurred at the edges. My thoughts scattered and reformed around a single overwhelming imperative. Go to the water. Go to the water. Go to the water. The singing began at midnight. It rose from the harbor in waves of sound that passed through walls and wood as if they were not there. It was louder than any previous night, so loud that it seemed to fill the entire world. I fell to my knees with my hands pressed against my ears, screaming words I do not remember, begging for the sound to stop. But it did not stop. It grew louder. It grew more insistent. It grew more beautiful until I found myself weeping at the sheer perfection of it, until I would have given anything to hear it more clearly, until the only thing that mattered in all the world was reaching the source of that magnificent sound. I do not remember removing the barricade from my door. I do not remember walking through the village. My next clear memory is standing on the pier with a dozen other villagers, all of us facing the water, all of us swaying slightly in time to the music that filled our heads. Clara Marsh stood beside me, her face slack and peaceful, her eyes fixed on something in the distance that I could not see. Blackwood was there too, and the old fisherman who lived next door to me, and a child of perhaps 8 who clutched a stuffed toy against her chest. We all stood together, waiting for something none of us could name. They rose from the water, just as Clara had described. Dozens of them, rising slowly from the black harbor, their gray bodies glistening in the faint moonlight. They were worse up close than I could have imagined. Their skin was covered in scales that caught the light like wet stone. Their faces had features, but the features were wrong. The eyes were too large and too dark, without pupils or whites. The mouths were too wide, stretching back to where ears should have been, filled with rows of teeth like broken glass. Their hands had fingers, but the fingers were webbed and ended in curved black talons. They moved with a terrible liquid grace, walking up the beach on legs that bent backward at the knee, approaching the pier where we stood frozen and waiting. The largest of them stopped at the edge of the pier and looked at us with those enormous dark eyes. It raised one hand and pointed at the child with the stuffed toy. The girl walked forward without hesitation, her feet making soft sounds on the wooden planks, her face still peaceful and empty. She walked to the edge of the pier and stepped off into the water without a splash. She sank immediately, the stuffed toy floating for a moment before following her down. The creature pointed again, and this time, an old man stepped forward, then a woman, then a young fisherman I had seen mending nets on the beach. One by one, they walked to the edge and stepped into the black water. One by one, they sank without struggle or sound. When the creature pointed at Clara Marsh, I felt something break inside me. The song still filled my head. The pull still tugged at my chest, but something deeper rose up against it. Perhaps it was the memory of her sitting beside me on the rocks, the only person in the village who had treated me like a human being. Perhaps it was simply rage at the injustice of what I was watching. Whatever the cause, I found myself moving before I could think. I grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her backward, away from the edge, away from the creature's pointing finger. The singing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Every creature in the water turned to look at me with those terrible dark eyes. The largest one lowered its hand and tilted its head in a motion that seemed almost curious. It opened its mouth and made a sound that was not the singing, a low, clicking noise that resonated in my bones. The other creatures answered with the same sound, and suddenly they were all clicking in unison, a rising chorus of noise that made my skull feel like it was splitting apart. I do not know what would have happened next. Perhaps they would have taken me. Perhaps they would have taken everyone. But at that moment, Blackwood stepped forward. He walked past me without a glance, walked straight to the edge of the pier, and spoke directly to the largest creature in a language I did not recognize. The clicking stopped. The creature listened. Blackwood spoke for several minutes, his voice steady and calm, gesturing occasionally toward me and toward Clara. When he finished, the creature was silent for a long moment. Then it nodded once, turned and walked back into the water. The others followed. Within minutes, the harbor was empty and still. Blackwood turned to face us. His expression was not angry. It was something worse. It was resigned. He told me that I had interrupted the ceremony. He told me that the debt had not been fully paid. He told me that the Deep Ones had accepted a substitute, but only because of what I was. He told me that my uncle had been one of them once, long ago, before he came to Kestrel Hollow. He told me that the blood in my veins was not entirely human. He told me that this was why the call affected me less than the others, why I could resist when they could not. The Deep Ones would not take their own, but because I had interfered, they would return tomorrow night to claim what they were owed. They would return every night until the debt was settled, and the debt had just grown larger. The next 3 nights were a nightmare from which I could not wake. Each evening, the singing rose from the harbor. Each evening, the villagers walked to the pier in a trance. Each evening, the Deep Ones rose from the water and pointed, and people walked into the black waves and did not return. By the end of the 3rd night, 17 people had been taken, nearly twice the usual number. And still the creatures came. Still they pointed. Still the debt remained unpaid. Clara stayed with me in my cottage during those terrible nights. Whatever I had done by pulling her back had broken the hold the song had over her. She could hear it still, she said, but it no longer compelled her to walk. She sat with me while the village emptied itself into the sea, and she told me stories about the people who were gone. The child with the stuffed toy had been named Elizabeth. She had wanted to be a teacher. The old fisherman had served on a whaling ship in his youth and had seen every ocean on earth. The young mother who walked into the water on the 2nd night had been pregnant with her 3rd child. Clara spoke their names so that someone would remember. I wrote them down so that the memory would survive. On the 4th night, Blackwood came to my cottage. He looked older than he had a week before, his face lined and gray, his massive shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He told me the village elders had met. He told me they had reached a decision. The debt had to be paid in full, or the Deep Ones would take everyone. The only way to settle the balance was to give them what they truly wanted. They wanted me. He explained that my uncle had not been born in Kestrel Hollow. He had come from another village further up the coast, a village that had also made a bargain with the things in the water. But my uncle had fled that village as a young man, had run from the call, had hidden himself among ordinary humans for decades. When he finally came to Kestrel Hollow, he thought he had escaped. He was wrong. The Deep Ones had long memories. They had found him eventually. They had called him into the water to pay the debt he had run from so many years before, and now that debt had passed to me. Blackwood said I could walk into the water willingly and end this. He said the village would be spared. He said Clara would be spared. He spoke without anger or accusation. He simply stated the facts and waited for my response. I looked at Clara, at the fear in her sea-glass eyes, at the hope she was trying to hide. I looked out the window at the fog rolling in from the harbor. I thought about the 17 people who had already died because of what I had done. I thought about how many more would follow if I refused. I told Blackwood I would go. Clara grabbed my arm and begged me to run. She said we could leave together, could escape inland, could hide somewhere the sea could not reach. But I knew it was useless. I had felt the call growing stronger every night. I had felt the pull in my chest spreading through my whole body. I could resist it now, but I would not be able to resist it forever. The Deep Ones would find me eventually, no matter where I ran. And every day I delayed, more people would die. Better to end it on my own terms. Better to choose the manner of my death than to have it chosen for me. We walked to the pier together as the sun set on the 4th night of winter. The remaining villagers lined the path. watching in silence as I passed. Some of them touched my shoulder as I walked by. Some of them murmured words I did not understand. Clara held my hand until we reached the water's edge, and then she let go. She was crying, but she did not try to stop me. She knew, as I knew, that there was no other way. The singing rose as the last light faded from the sky. The deep ones emerged from the harbor, more of them than I had ever seen, rising in a great circle around the pier. The largest one approached and stood before me, its dark eyes fixed on my face with an expression I could not read. It reached out one webbed hand and touched my cheek with fingers that were cold and wet and surprisingly gentle. It made the clicking sound, and the others answered, and then it stepped aside and gestured toward the water. I walked to the edge of the pier. I looked down at the black waves lapping against the wooden posts. I felt the pull in my chest stronger than ever, not fighting me now, but welcoming me, drawing me forward into an embrace I had been running from my entire life. I took a deep breath of the cold salt air. I closed my eyes. I stepped forward, and then I felt a hand grab my collar and yank me backwards so hard that I fell onto the pier. Clara stood over me with a gutting knife in her hand. Blood ran down her arm from a deep cut in her palm. She was shouting something at the creatures, words in the same strange language Blackwood had used 4 nights before. The deep ones had gone still, their dark eyes fixed on the blood dripping from her hand into the water. She kept shouting, kept bleeding, kept standing between me and the edge of the pier. Finally, the largest creature raised its hand. The others fell silent. It looked at Clara for a long moment, then at me, then back at Clara. It nodded once, and then, without another sound, every creature sank beneath the waves and disappeared. I learned later what Clara had done. The bargain that protected Kestrel Hollow allowed for substitution, a life for a life. Blood willingly given could pay a debt that blood unwillingly taken could not. By cutting her own flesh and offering her blood to the water, Clara had volunteered to take my place, but the deep ones had not accepted the trade. They had simply withdrawn. The debt remained unpaid, but it had been suspended, deferred. The creatures would return someday to collect what they were owed, but not tonight, not this year, perhaps not for a generation. The village buried its dead in empty coffins the next morning. There were no bodies to bury, but the living needed rituals to help them grieve. I stood beside Clara in the small cemetery on the hill above the harbor and listened to the minister speak words of comfort that none of us believed. When the service was over, I walked back to my cottage and began to pack my things. I could not stay in Kestrel Hollow. I could not live in a place where the sea had nearly claimed me, where it would certainly claim me if I remained. I had to run, just as my uncle had run before me. Clara found me at the coach station the next morning. She was wearing traveling clothes and carrying a small bag. She told me she was coming with me. She told me she had nothing left in Kestrel Hollow worth staying for. She told me that the blood she had spilled had bound her to me in ways neither of us fully understood. We were connected now, she and I, linked by the debt we shared. Wherever I went, she would follow. I did not argue. I was too tired and too grateful to be alive. We boarded the coach together and left Kestrel Hollow behind. 2 months later, in February, we received word that the village was empty. Every remaining resident had walked into the sea on the same night. Every house stood abandoned. Every door facing the ocean stood wide open. The deep ones had returned to collect what they were owed. They had taken everyone. Clara and I married in the spring of 1892. We settled in Boston, as far from the ocean as we could manage, while still remaining in the city. I took a position as a clerk in a law firm. Clara found work as a seamstress. We built a quiet life together, a normal life, the kind of life that people in Kestrel Hollow had never been allowed to have. We had 2 children, a boy and a girl. We raised them without ever speaking of the village or the things that lived in the water. We pretended to be ordinary people with ordinary histories. We almost succeeded. But the sea has a long memory, longer than I had hoped, longer than I had feared. The dreams began in my 40th year. I would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of singing, the same not singing that had filled the harbor of Kestrel Hollow. I would find myself standing at the window, staring in the direction of the coast, feeling the familiar pull in my chest. The hook had never truly been removed. It had only been sleeping, and now it was waking again. Clara felt it too. She never spoke of it directly, but I could see it in the way she avoided looking east, in the way she flinched when she heard seagulls, in the way she sometimes stopped in the middle of a sentence and tilted her head as if listening to something far away. The blood she had spilled had connected her to the deep ones in ways we did not understand. The debt she had deferred had not been forgiven. It was still waiting. It would always be waiting. Our son began having nightmares when he was 12. He dreamed of walking into cold black water. He dreamed of shapes rising from the depths. He dreamed of singing that filled his head until there was no room for anything else. We took him to doctors who found nothing wrong. We took him to ministers who prayed over him without effect. We moved further inland to a town in western Massachusetts, where the ocean was a 3-day journey away. The nightmares continued. The pull grew stronger. By the time he was 17, he could no longer resist. We found him on the morning of the winter solstice, standing in the middle of a frozen pond behind our house, staring at the ice beneath his feet. He did not respond when we called his name. He did not resist when we pulled him back to shore. But his eyes were empty and distant, fixed on something we could not see. He spoke only once before he collapsed into silence. He said they were calling him. He said it was time to pay. We left Massachusetts that same day. We traveled west as far as we could go until we reached a desert town in Arizona where rain was rare and the ocean was 1,000 miles away. We thought we would be safe there. We thought the distance would protect us. We were wrong again. The deep ones do not need the ocean. The ocean is simply where they prefer to live. They can travel through any water, through rivers and lakes and underground streams, through rain and fog and the moisture in the soil. They are patient. They are eternal. They will wait as long as necessary to collect what they are owed. And what they are owed is us, all of us. Every person who carries the blood of those who made bargains in the darkness, every descendant of every village that traded souls for prosperity, the debt passes down through generations. The debt never expires. The debt must be paid. Clara died in 1912, 21 years after we left Kestrel Hollow. She walked into the desert one night and never returned. They found her body 3 days later, face down in a shallow wash, her lungs filled with salt water, despite the fact that the nearest ocean was 1,000 miles away. Our son disappeared the following year. Our daughter lasted until 1923. I am the only one left. I hear the singing every night now. It is louder than it has ever been, more beautiful than anything in this world has a right to be. I feel the pull in my chest with every breath, a constant pressure that has become almost comfortable. I know they are coming for me. I know the debt is finally due. I have run for 43 years, and my running is almost done. But before I go, I need you to understand something. The bargains are still being made. In fishing villages along every coast, in communities beside lakes and rivers, In any place where people depend on water for their survival, the deep ones are waiting. They are patient. They are always there, just beneath the surface, ready to offer prosperity in exchange for something more precious than money. They speak to desperate people in dreams and whispers. They make promises that seem too good to refuse. And once the bargain is struck, it can never be broken. If you live near the water, listen carefully on winter nights. If you hear singing that is not quite singing, if you feel a pull toward the shore that you cannot explain, if you wake to find yourself standing at the water's edge with no memory of how you got there, then you are already part of the debt. Your blood has been marked. Your name has been recorded. Someday, the deep ones will come to collect. I can hear them outside my window now. I can hear the wet sound of their footsteps crossing the dry ground. They have come a long way to find me. They have waited a long time. But the waiting is over. The drowning season has come at last. Remember Kestrel Hollow. Remember the 47 people who walked into the sea. Remember that prosperity has a price, and the price is always paid in blood. Remember that the water remembers everything, and the water never forgives. The singing is so loud now, so beautiful. I think I finally understand why people walk willingly into the waves. It is not the pull that takes them. It is the music. It is the promise of peace in the cold, dark deep. It is the knowledge that the struggle is finally over. They are at my door. I can hear the clicking of their teeth. I can smell the salt and the rot and the ancient patience of the abyss. My hand is on the doorknob. I am going to open it now. I am going to walk with them into the darkness. I hope you can learn from my warning. I hope you can escape what I could not escape. I hope the water never learns your name. But if it does, if the singing fills your head and the pull takes hold of your heart, remember this: the sea always wins. The sea always takes what it is owed. And the sea is everywhere, even in the desert. Even in the places where you think you are safe, there is no running far enough. There is no hiding deep enough. There is only the debt and the water and the endless patient hunger of the deep. Remember us. Remember what we paid.